"What's your issue?" The woman snapped at Darius, shoulders squared. Her voice was sharp enough that the entire line turned to look. She stood directly behind him, too close, pushing her cart's front wheel into the back of his leg. The grocery store's bright lighting highlighted every twitch of her face, every taut muscle along her jawline. The place had that typical hum. People waiting to pay, bored children complaining, clerks scanning a thin backdrop of generic pop music overhead. But now heads were turning. A sudden hush sucked the warmth from the air. He could feel the eyes on them. On him. Darius had just been minding his own business, waiting to check out with a basket of produce and a loaf of bread. He was tall, dark-skinned, wearing a pressed collared shirt and neatly cuffed jeans. He turned slightly. He'd heard enough of her huffs and mutters, but when she bumped his leg, he needed to look to see if it was an accident. Her eyes confirmed it wasn't. She looked furious before the confrontation had even begun. Maybe something had spoiled her day. Maybe she just wanted a fight. Either way, he was caught in her line of fire. "Now I'm just waiting in line," Darius said, voice steady. He adjusted his grip on the basket, his fingertips turning white where they pressed into the plastic handle. "You've been on your phone, holding up the line," she declared, though he hadn't touched his phone in ages. She had the tone of someone seeking justification after acting first, like a cat hissing before it understands why. Several people nearby observed, some with mouths slightly open, as if ready to intervene, but nobody did yet. "I'm not holding anything up," he replied calmly. "The cashier is still busy with the person in front of me." Darius gestured toward the older gentleman fumbling with coupons at the counter. The line simply wasn't moving. It had nothing to do with him. Her lips curled back, revealing a tight, humorless grin. "Don't talk back to me," she spat. A few more heads turned. Darius met the gaze of a store employee a few feet away, who seemed unsure if he should intervene. Darius raised a reassuring calm as if to say, "I got this," though he wasn't entirely certain he did. "I'm not talking back. I'm just explaining what's happening," Darius said, forcing his voice to stay steady. These encounters could shift quickly, especially when the person confronting him was an angry white woman who wore her entitlement like an expensive fragrance. He'd seen it before. A flash of anger, a shrill complaint, police called over nothing. He took a quiet breath. "Stay calm." "Don't you dare give me attitude," she snapped. "I see how you people act, taking up space, cutting lines, being lazy, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Her voice rose, a knife scraping through the hush of the store. Darius's heart raced. "You've got no respect," she continued, "just standing there like you own the place." Darius noticed her face in detail. Mid-40s, meticulously straightened blonde hair, large sunglasses perched atop her head, an expensive handbag over her shoulder. She had the look of someone whose entire life was a series of demands, the kind who spoke to managers and expected things done her way. He wondered if she understood the risk he took by simply existing, by responding. He tried once more to reason. "Ma'am, I'm not cutting. I've been here. Everyone's waiting." "Don't me," she retorted, voice rising another notch. The others in line stepped back slightly, forming a loose circle. Phones started appearing, recording. Darius's stomach clenched. He didn't want to be part of the next viral crazy Karen moment. He just wanted to buy his groceries. "I'm just trying to get my things and go home," Darius said, forcing a polite smile. He glanced to the cashier, who was still stuck with the elderly man's coupons. Another minute. He could have been out the door. Another minute. She jabbed her cart forward again, hitting the back of his leg. Darius stepped forward, wincing. "You're too close. Could you please give me some space?" he managed. "Space?" she echoed mockingly. "I'd like some space from you. You don't belong here anyway." Her eyes narrowed, voice dropping low, dripping venom. "Go back to Africa." A hush ripped through the crowd. Darius froze for a moment. The beeping scanners, the overhead announcements, the squeaking of a toddler's shoes all faded away. Silence rang in his ears. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was hatred laid bare. Another customer gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" A clerk's eyes went wide. Two teenagers with phones out exchanged horrified glances. No one stepped in yet, but the tension soared. Darius felt his blood pounding. "Excuse me," Darius said softly, voice quieter than before. She smirked, triumphant. You heard me. If you don't like it here, you can go back to Africa. Don't come to my country and tell me what to do. Darius stared at her, heart churning. He considered his options. Walk away, try to de-escalate, stand his ground. Rage and pain pressed behind his eyes. He felt the weight of countless ancestors' stories passed down, the legacy of struggle and perseverance. He clenched his teeth so hard his jaw hurt. He noticed a store employee hovering at the edge of his vision, thin young guy in a green apron, shocked. Darius shook his head slightly. Not yet. He wanted to handle this himself. Turning fully toward her, Darius let his voice remain calm. You're telling me to go back to Africa? He said slowly. Have you ever even been to Africa? Do you know what you're talking about? Inside, he was raging, but he forced composure. Oh, please, she snarled. I'm tired of people like you always playing the victim. This is America. We built this country. If you have a problem, you leave. Darius saw eyes widen around them. A few people whispered, This is insane. A young black woman down the line, tears threatening, clenched her fists. Darius met her eyes, then looked back at this woman, a so-called Karen. Something in him shifted. He wouldn't be silent. He wouldn't let her words stand unchallenged. Too many times he'd chosen silence for safety. Not today. Darius spoke without raising his voice. Who is this we who built this country? He took a measured step, the crowd giving him space. My ancestors were brought here in chains. They built roads, tilled fields, and created wealth under pain and lash. Their labor and suffering are woven into this nation's foundation. Meanwhile, people like you profited directly or indirectly. There's no America without black Americans. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She stared at him, momentarily speechless. Darius pressed on, voice calm but resonant. When you say go back to Africa, you deny that we have been here since the start. Our legacy runs deep in the soil of this country. You can't dismiss that. She sputtered. Oh, spare me the lecture. I don't care what you think you're entitled to. Why don't you step aside and let real Americans get on with their day? Darius planted himself, not budging. You want me to move? You want me to yield to your hatred? His voice tightened, but he kept control. No, not this time. Cameras were filming. Darius saw them and no longer cared. Let them record. Let them see. He took a step back and closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, drawing in the scent of ripe bananas and bread. When he opened them, everyone watched. It may surprise you, he began, speaking to her but for everyone's benefit. But Africa is not a monolith. It's vast. It's where human life began. Telling me to go back is ignorant. Maybe I can share some knowledge. She scoffed. But he continued in a voice low and steady. Darius began to speak of kingdoms that predated European colonization, of Mansa Musa's wealth, of Timbuktu's libraries, of the Swahili coast's trade routes. He spoke of how enslaved Africans carried culture, language, and resilience across an ocean. He described the horrors of the Middle Passage, and how under unimaginable torment they forged new traditions, spirituals, and foods that survive to this day. He spoke of the civil rights movement, the long fight for equality, the forging of a new identity that blended African roots with American struggle. The crowd leaned in, captivated. The Karen's face twisted in confusion and anger. She didn't expect a history lesson. Darius pressed on, voice never rising, words flowing like a teacher unveiling truths long buried. Every part of American culture, from music to language to cuisine, has been touched by black influence. Jazz, blues, hip-hop, spirituals, all creations born of our roots, our struggle and resilience, shaped this country's soul. Phones recorded. People listened. Store employees hovered, unsure whether to speak. The Karen tried to interject, but Darius raised a gentle hand, cutting her off gracefully. He described Sunday dinners and church choirs, family reunions and community centers, protest marches and poetry slams. He painted a vivid tapestry of a people who refused to be broken, who made beauty out of pain and complexity out of loss. He spoke of how he, Darius, was born here. His parents and grandparents were born here. Yet people like her still dared to treat him as foreign. He layered on, detail after detail, how Black Americans weren't just part of the narrative, but central to it. He wanted the crowd to feel it, to understand that her hateful command was not just a slur, but an attempt to erase centuries of integral presence and contribution. When Darius finished, the silence was thick. The Karen's face was flushed. She gripped her cart handle, knuckles white. She looked around for allies and found none. The circle of witnesses bore down with disapproval, disgust, and shock. A middle-aged man shook his head at her. A young mother pressed her lips tight in outrage. A teenager whispered, "That's messed up." Darius looked her in the eye. His voice was softer now. "When you say go back to Africa, you're telling me to abandon the land where my ancestors are buried, where my grandmother marched, where my father taught me to hold my head high. You're telling me to leave a country my ancestors helped build under the whip? A culture we carved out of stolen heritage? That is not something I'll do." The store felt airless. The Karen's mouth opened and closed without sound. She struggled to muster a response. Maybe she wanted to scream, "I don't care," or call for a manager. But faced with the camera phones, the shocked silence, and Darius's calm defiance, she hesitated. He had no desire to gloat. He'd said what he needed to say. He bent down, picked up his basket, and stepped forward in line, placing his groceries on the conveyor belt. The cashier scanned silently, still processing what had just unfolded. The beep of the scanner was the only sound. For a moment, the Karen stood stiffly behind him, seething but unsure how to proceed. Darius felt her eyes on his back, but he didn't turn. He took his receipt, nodded to the cashier, and stepped away, groceries in hand. Then, unexpectedly, a soft clap echoed through the silence. One pair of hands. Then two. Then a ripple of applause. Not wild, but heartfelt. People nodded at Darius, some smiling with respect. A man with damp eyes mouthed, "Thank you." Darius swallowed, acknowledging them with a slight nod. Behind him, the Karen flinched at the applause, her face tightening like she'd been slapped. Her eyes darted around, desperate for an exit, some show of support. Finding none, she mumbled under her breath and pushed her cart away, rattling off down the aisle, shoulders rigid with humiliation and anger. Darius watched her retreat for a moment, then made his way toward the exit. The crowd parted gently, some still holding phones up, recording his departure. Near the door, the young black woman he'd seen earlier stepped forward, tears in her eyes, but smiling now. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. "I never know what to say when they do that. I just freeze." Darius understood that feeling. "Sometimes I freeze too," he said softly. "Today I just had to speak." She nodded, wiping a tear and stepping back, letting him pass. Outside, the sun was bright. The parking lot bustled with cars and shoppers. Darius drew a deep breath. He replayed the encounter in his mind, unsure if there was a right way to feel. He was proud he'd stood up for himself and his heritage, proud he hadn't resorted to insults or threats. But he also felt a familiar sadness that such hatred still lived so openly. He walked across the lot, keys in hand, loaded his groceries into his trunk before getting in the car. He paused, leaning against the vehicle's frame. Inside that store, he'd confronted a piece of America's ugly past and present. Here, he had refused to yield, and maybe that would mean something to the people who witnessed it. Maybe someone would think twice the next time. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine. The radio came on, playing an old soul track, a voice lamenting about hardship and hope. Darius let it fill the car as he pulled out. He pictured his grandmother's stories, his father's lessons, all the cultural richness passed down through generations. He had faced hatred head-on, countered it with history and truth, and walked away with his dignity intact. At the edge of the lot, Darius glanced back at the store. He imagined the subdued chatter inside, people whispering, employees shaking their heads. Maybe someone would watch the footage later and learn something. He couldn't control that. He had done what he could. Darius turned onto the main road, gripping the steering wheel, the sunlight warm on his face. The world went on. He carried with him the memory of that standoff, painful, intense, and yet affirming. He belonged here, and he had made that clear. Now, No demand to go back would ever make him yield again.